unique. You are what you do. You can say any amount of things that you want to say, but what you do is what everybody sees.
People are like, oh, I'm just going to JV it. Like, it's just JV it. Like, what the hell is that mean?
I cannot tell you how excited I am to hang out with you guys today. So thank you so much.
Well, then that end buyer could come back and say, well, I didn't fully understand that it was subject to.
That's not a thing. Like, the SEC has thought of all of these things. They've been here since 1932.
And you can do what you want with your property.
Buyers have time, they have negotiating power, they have options.
Oh my gosh, I am blown away by your inexperience, and they've been in business 20 years.
And that includes things other people put on your property, right? It's your property, Leo, okay? Suddenly Cousin Jimmy's in a lawsuit.
A novation is replacing one contract or one obligation with another.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yes.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Today, our topic is the do's and don'ts of multifamily investing. I'm Andy Fowler, and I'm here with Sean St. Clair. If you're new to the show, make sure to give us a like. We are on YouTube and we're on Facebook. You can find us at InRem Podcast. That is at InRem Podcast. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who has our legal update.
Thank you, Andy. So my legal update today is a continuation of last week's, which is discussing the Alabama Act number 2023-201. That act has two components, as we discussed last week. The first component was eliminating 40-year listing agreements where there's certain brokerages that go and basically pay homeowners to sign a listing agreement with them that lasts for 40 years. And then they record the listing agreement and clouds the title to their property. And then when they go to sell the property, numerous years thereafter, they can't sell the property because they have this cloud unless they pay a sizable amount to the broker who obtained their signature on the listing agreement. So the second component of this act deals with wholesaling, and it has disclosures regarding wholesaling and what must be disclosed to a seller, as well as a purchaser of a property that is being wholesaled or that the contract for the property is being assigned. Our very first episode of InRem, probably about a year and a half ago now, dealt with a act that was passed here in Arizona that had disclosures on wholesaling. The Alabama Act isn't significantly different. There's a few nuances that are different, but it's relatively the same. However, the penalties for violating the Alabama Act are significantly greater than a violation of the Arizona wholesale disclosure law. So what must be disclosed? So let's talk about that first. So there's three things that have to be disclosed in a wholesale transaction. The first is you have to disclose from at the point that you're negotiating with the seller and you're going to enter into a contract with the seller, you have to disclose to the seller that you as the buyer intend to market your equitable interest in the property and potentially assign the contract to a third party who will close on the transaction. So you have to let the seller know, hey, I plan to market my equitable interest in the property and potentially sell that equitable, or we also call it a contract interest to a third party. The other thing that you have to disclose to a seller is if you do find an assignee for the purchase contract, you have to disclose to the seller 3 business days before that assignment becomes effective that you have assigned and will be assigning the contract to a third party. So basically, you have to give the seller 3 business days notice of your assignment, and your assignment cannot be effective until you've given that 3 business days notice to the seller. And then the final thing that you have to disclose is to a prospective purchaser or assignee of the contract, you have to disclose the fact that you only have an equitable interest in the property. You don't actually have fee title, fee ownership of the property. You simply have an equitable interest via a purchase contract, and that has to be disclosed in all marketing. Now, most assuming that you're going to market in the MLS or multiple listing service, most MLS regulations require that disclosure. Like, you can't just say, well, I'm the owner, even though you only have a contract for the property. You have to disclose in the listing anyway that you only have an equitable interest. That was, per MLS regulations anyway. So I'm not sure that this changes much from, the marketing perspective, but I would also recommend that in the assignment, which an assignment of a contract kind of implies that, but nevertheless, put in the assignment that, your interest is only an equitable interest in the property. Now, what happens if you don't disclose this information or don't provide these disclosures? Well, in Arizona, we have similar disclosures, and basically the contract's canceled. The seller gets to retain the earnest money. The buyer gets or the assignee gets their earnest money back. And that's assuming that it's canceled before the contract is actually performed. In Alabama, it's a little different. If you don't provide these disclosures, it's actually a Class C misdemeanor. Now, most misdemeanors don't involve jail time. They generally involve a fine or a penalty, some type of monetary penalty. However, they can involve jail time if a judge is upset enough or the prosecutor's upset enough and doesn't offer anything other than jail time, and you're convicted. Potentially a judge could sentence you to jail for a misdemeanor, but it's rare. But nevertheless, it is something that's possible, but it is a crime. It's a misdemeanor in Alabama not to provide these disclosures. It also allows for monetary damages, basically up to 3 times the amount gained through the undisclosed wholesale. So if you complete the transaction and you don't give the disclosures and your wholesale fee was, say $50,000, well, now your damages to that seller if you haven't provided those disclosures is $150,000. So that's significant. That's, way different than our penalties here in Arizona. If you violate the Alabama Act, there's, significant consequences for the violation. So, keep an eye out on this. Alabama, Arizona is one of, many states that have passed, disclosure language regulations or disclosure laws with respect to wholesaling. Other states are Arkansas, Illinois, Oklahoma, and Texas. And I'm sure there's significantly more on the horizon, as well as other potential legislation regarding, requiring wholesalers to have a real estate license and those types of things. So if you're wholesaling, make sure that you consult with an attorney in the state where you're entering into contracts to make sure that you're putting all the required language in those contracts and making sure that you're, and even, in this case in Alabama, giving disclosures in advance of assignments and things like that. So exactly step by step what you have to do to properly disclose, what your intentions are with respect to the property, disclose your assignment, and disclose your equitable interest to a prospective buyer.
All right. Thank you, Sean. With that, we're going to get into a few announcements here at In Rem. Coming up tomorrow at 5 o'clock and every Wednesday at 5 o'clock p.m., we air the Creative Finance Collective. If you're new and you haven't been a part of the Creative Finance Collective, what is the Creative Finance Collective? That is what it sounds like. It's essentially a collection or membership of professionals, mainly lawyers, that are in the space of creative finance and are exploring the laws of creative financing from different perspectives and importantly, I think, from different jurisdictions. So, for example, Sean and I have been on the collective, but we've got attorneys like Alan Seschker or Scott Horn in Texas. We've got attorneys from Ohio like Jeff Watson. We've got attorneys from California. So we've had attorneys that are part of this each week from all over the country. And it's really been an exceptional opportunity frankly, it's selfishly, I guess, for us as attorneys to kind of learn from each other on how we can make the process better. But it really is an extraordinary process for you, the viewer, because what we do is we make ourselves available. It's not a structured show like it is today, and like the normal NREM podcast. It's a live show available for questions the entire hour. So you, as the listener, have at your disposal lawyers from all over the country to discuss whatever issue you're facing relating to creative financing. It's an awesome opportunity to make sure to join us. Again, that's tomorrow, 5 o'clock Arizona time. Sean, what are your thoughts on how it's been going?
The collective's been great. I've had to miss a few weeks here, but the times that I was able to attend, I learned a lot. And it really was beneficial for me to be able to listen to these other attorneys and have the discussions on how they address certain things like assignments and subject to documents and different clauses that they put in there, structuring of wrap notes and deeds of trust, mortgages, the language that they like to see in there on those instruments. It's just a real learning experience. It's great to be able to network and collaborate with these attorneys. Frankly, if I live local to these attorneys, I'd be wanting to, connect with them on a weekly or monthly basis for lunch and other things like that. And essentially that's what we're doing on the collective. Obviously it's by video, but we're connecting with them on a more, personal level. We're networking with them. And the cool thing is the audience can watch. If I were to go to lunch with one of these attorneys, it would just be me and this attorney talking shop. But in this case, the audience can actually watch and see us talk shop and hear us and, learn in the process.
Yeah. And, just by example, unplanned, in the last Creative Finance Collective, I got into a detailed discussion with Scott Horn, who teaches a lien class. He's got an entire class on liens. Well, of course, everybody, when we talk about creative finance and subject to transactions, we always talk about taking property subject to the existing loans, but nobody ever talks about what else you might be taking it subject to. And it might be more than just existing loans. It could be IRS liens. It could be a variety of different judgment liens, whatever the case may be. We had an opportunity to get into that, take questions about that. We took some questions about land trust and integrating that. So it's an awesome opportunity. Make sure to be a part of that. Also, today we are taking any questions that the audience has in the final 15 minutes of the show. I'm going to turn it over to Mayu, who can give you kind of an idea about how you can engage or begin engaging in the process to state what questions you might have for us and our guests.
Thank you, Andy. Happy Tuesday, everyone. We made it to August 1st, and you are watching the NREM podcast live. Welcome to the show, and thank you all for watching. If you've joined us before on the show, you do know that Andy and Sean and our guests do take questions live on the show. Wherever you're watching NREM, whether it's from our Facebook or YouTube, we do see your live comments, and we are monitoring the chats for your questions. We take questions in order of priority, so don't wait. If you have a great question in mind, be sure to leave it in the comments, and we'll try to get to all the questions in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the show. Today's topic is the do's and don'ts of multifamily investing, so let's get into it.
All right. Thank you, Mayu. That's right. That's what she said. We're talking about multifamily investing, multifamily real estate. And with us to talk about multifamily investing is Sophia Willets. Sophia, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, it's awesome having you. So you're a broker and you're an investor. Tell us a little bit about what you do. Tell us about your company, Grace CRE, and how you got into it.
Absolutely. So I was actually raised by an immigrant from Austria.
Oh, cool.
My dad's from there. He moved out here I would say like a long time ago. He's almost 80 now, but he moved out here when he was 21. He learned how to work on cars, didn't have much education. And then he ended up buying a car lot and he sold that and bought multifamily, and he retired at 36. So I was raised by an investor.
So you were born into this?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
Not wanting to be, but didn't realize how much impact he would have on my life. So I watched him be a slumlord. We would dumpster dive and fix up these really crappy apartments here in downtown Phoenix. But, they provided income for our family growing up. So didn't know that was going to be my destiny.
So Well, I think you answered this question, but when he immigrated here, was it 2 right here in the Valley, right in
No, he
Arizona?
moved to Connecticut first and then, California and other places, but he ended up here in Phoenix.
Did his multifamily investing process, did that start here in Arizona or
Yes, it
outside?
was in Phoenix. My dad ended up, he was a hustler, learned how to work on cars, but it pretty much broke his back. So he had to find another way of income. How else can you get it by passive income but multifamily?
So this was the family business.
Yes. Yes, it was.
So tell us about Grace CRE.
So I didn't start owning a brokerage, obviously, but I'll kind of give you the background story on that. I was a wannabe investor in my early 20s. I'm 40 now, but I was working at a furniture shop. I made 65,000 a year. I thought I was a big baller. At that time, like in the early 2000s, that was a lot of money. And I wanted to be an investor like my dad, but I didn't invest in multifamily. I invested in single family,
Mm.
condos, houses. I would take out notes and I would owe more money every single time I made a payment. My rents weren't covering the notes, but I thought I was going to flip all these properties and make all this money. And then when 2008 happened, my dad was selling his property, his multifamily he owned for like 20 something years in '06, '07. He's like, Sophia, don't buy in the market. You're going to lose everything. I'm like, oh, Papa, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, I'm going to be successful like you were. I lost it all. I was $1 million in debt at 24 years old. I had to file bankruptcy, had all the foreclosures go after me. I had to give up my cars. I pretty much was dead flat broke. And top it all, I ended up getting pregnant with my husband. And so that's how I kind of started. Like the recession was not having a job, going back to beauty school, and actually, like, I just want to work part time and do hair and all that stuff. So I did about that for about 5 years. And after 5 years, I realized after having my second child at that point, I had a 2.5-year-old and a 5-month-old, that having only $340 in my bank account and putting groceries on credit cards, and these were my mom's credit cards because remember, I filed bankruptcy,
Sure.
was no longer a way that I could see an end in sight. And even after having a loan modification, because back in the day you could get a loan mod, I was like,
Mhm.
man, I'm still struggling. When am I going to see success? And I always loved real estate. And I'm like, you know what? I want to get my real estate license. So I told my ex-husband, I'm like, you know what? I want to get back into real estate. He's like, it's not the right time. I'm like, you know what? It's never going to be the right time. So I took out a loan out of his 401k and I went all in on real estate. I got my license within 6 weeks and I worked for a small apartment broker named S.J. Fowler. Your guys' last name, or I'm assuming
Sure.
your last name, but I went to work for him because I felt it would be more recession proof. When he told me that I could sell apartments, office, retail, and residential, I was like, oh, I've already been through a recession. I want more opportunities to make money.
Mhm.
What I didn't know was my niche was going to be multifamily. I thought I was going to be a pretty little broker that just did open houses and, cared about like how something looks, but I really couldn't get into that lingo because I was raised by an investor and I don't care about those like things that are like, oh, this is so pretty, or this looks a certain way. Like, does it produce income? Does it make money? Does it make sense? So my broker gave me a LoopNet lead and I sold him a building the first 10 days that I got my license. And then I sold 24 buildings my first year. And my ex-husband quit his job and then he was able to stay at home full time with the kids. So that kind of started my journey into creating my own brokerage. I think I started my own brokerage in 2019, Grace CRE, and I didn't quite fit in really anywhere. I wanted to create my own space where I could actually obviously keep more of the commissions and then actually build out a team. So in 2019 is when I built out my team. And that's when I created Grace CRE with my husband.
So Sean and I discussed this a lot. We were both attorneys working together through the last recession.
Mm-hmm.
So we went through it not as real estate investors. I guess you could say every homeowner went through it in some sense as a
Yeah.
real estate investor during that period of time. But we counseled real estate investors or people that just own their homes that were, going through the Great Recession. It was a time in real estate that I don't know that this country's ever seen before. And what's interesting about that is we talk to a lot of investors now have this perception of up-only markets, right? You know, we've had an up-only market, though the last couple of years have been a little bit different. But we had a long trajectory of going up, and a lot of investors were born in that environment. And they
Yes.
haven't experienced what was the Great Recession, which was some of us still have PTSD from it, right?
I
I mean,
definitely did. But going back to that, so when I got my license in 2013, the average sales price per unit back then was 40 to 60,000 a unit.
Mm.
And if you fast forward to 2021, the average sales price here in Phoenix was 325,000, 355,000. How much of an increase can you really get here in that short period of time, even less than 10 years?
Mhm.
It's not a sustainable market. But, you know, like I have seen a lot of change here in the marketplace. It's the first time now in 10 years that the rents are actually inverting here in Phoenix. Our vacancy has went up from a 4.5 now to over 11% vacancy. We have all this new product being delivered, and all these investors that came in from California, all these syndication groups, really, they're like, oh, the market's, like when they came in 2016 and 17, they saw the market continuing to rise. It rose exponentially, but people got really overconfident in the market, and they got anybody that's really actually got a loan in 2019, 20, 21, 22 that are getting that short-term dev 18 months to 36 months or even less than 5 years. Now they can't refi out their properties. Now there's all these capital calls being called due.
Mm.
And all I see is like an amazing opportunity right now to take advantage of those situations. I've been actually looking up everyone's notes that are due less than a year. And everyone that bought in those notes recently only put like 25% down, and they did these 7% rates for these crazy bridge notes. So
Mm.
now, people went in and bought, like really bid up our market, but it was just in a bubble. And now the market's, the larger institutional deals are now going down 45 to 35%. And people are now like in this denial phase, like, oh, the property's still worth it, but the rents are going down and then the vacancy is going up. And then the rates are so high that you can't refi out of these assets now. So like I feel like we're going to see the biggest transition of wealth that we've ever seen. 2008 is like a joke. But when it comes to like the multifamily space, I see the biggest transfer of wealth about to happen.
Interesting. Well, and where I was going with my question before was kind of to some of this. To what extent do you think your journey beginning during the Great Recession or just prior to it and then into it, how has that shaped you as a broker and a real estate and as an investor?
Sure. So I stayed a sales agent from 2013 to 2019. It took me a long time to, even though I had almost 1,000 transactions under my belt, I still was too scared to invest, but I missed out on, I would say, like hundreds of millions of dollars. I would go in and find these opportunities for investors. I would get a small commission, and then they would make several million, or some of them even several $100 million in opportunities that I found them. But then what was in it for me? So what gave me the courage was actually giving back to the community. I had an investor that wanted me to help him teach a multifamily class. So I went with his group. I helped teach a class, and I had a wholesaler. This is back in 2019. Bring me an off-market transaction that was brought to him by a wholesaler, by another wholesaler, by another wholesaler. A whole Jay-Z chain of who the hell knows, like who was actually under contract. So I was like, screw all you guys. I'm just going to go direct to the seller. So I did. And the seller was actually a broker of HomeSmart. And it was one of his first investments. And I went in that deal as a 7-plex here in Tempe. It had a few studios, some ones, and I think it had 2 twos. But I saw it as an opportunity. I was like, oh, I can make a quick commission. But then I was like, man, this is such a great location. And I'm like, when is it going to be my turn to actually start investing? So I went in the deal non-refundable. I did 90,000 down, hard money note, and I knew that I could use the cash flow, the underwriting process on him. I already knew where the comps were actually at. And with the smaller apartments, you can actually sell them not as much as like where like the larger institutional deals is really based off the income, but you can actually do more performance on the 2 to 100 unit range and be able to exit at a much better price. So that's exactly what I did. All I did was take really nice pictures after I closed, and I closed it all cash within 5 weeks, and I think I made $375,000 for doing nothing to the property. So then I took that investment and kept growing it and flipping, and then I grew it to 6 million very quickly. But if I would have actually held on to that asset, if I would have held on to that asset for 3 years, I would have only netted cash flow of about $60,000, and I would have only been able to grow that particular investment maybe another $150,000 to $200,000. So, like, I like to make 300 to 500% returns on my investments, and I know how to do that, and that's why I'm like, I'd rather take that money and run and grow it faster that way, so there's better opportunities, like right now in this marketplace, where all the capital calls are being called due on the larger deals to be able to hold those a little bit longer.
So you got a strategy and you like to stick to it.
Yes.
Gotcha. So we've got a lot of listeners to the show who might be learning about multifamily for the first time. So some of this stuff for you is kindergarten level questions, but it helps the potential investors to know what we're talking about. So what qualifies, and I don't mean this as a legal question because I know the answer can be different depending on whether you're saying what the law says or what a particular statute says versus what an investor or a broker might say. But what qualifies in your mind when you say multifamily property? What are we talking about?
Anything more than 2 doors. And then if it's considered to be residential, or you can just do a regular residential contract, that's 2 to 4 units. Anything above that is considered to be commercial, and that's 5 units plus.
Okay. So in your mind, anything 2 doors or more, we're talking about multifamily, and
Correct.
that's something within your basket of assets you're looking at either acquiring or selling. And
Yes.
you might have touched on some of this in some of your history, because you did some single family dwelling investing early on, but why multifamily dwelling investing now over just single family residence? Why do you like it?
So, number one reason why I love multifamily investing is it's recession proof. I will have an investor that's willing to pay the height of the market, and also will, like, if we're in a down market, I have an investor that still will buy in the down market. So there's always an opportunity with multifamily, no matter what economy that we're actually in. Now, location will be a huge driver of that. So, like, as long as you're in the right location, multifamily is a slam dunk. If you're in a location such as California or Chicago or those type of areas that the tenant has more rights than you, you very may, like, be able to lose your asset that way. So for me, it really just depends. I love multifamily, but there's conditions on that, and depending on what state that you're actually in. I don't love multifamily in certain states where I don't have rights as a landlord.
Sophia, and you've already touched on this a little bit, but in addition to tenants' rights and these states that tend to be tenant friendly. Fortunately, here in Arizona, we're landlord friendly, but in states where it's tenant friendly, obviously that's a risk. But what are some of the other risks associated with multifamily? It's kind of the hot thing right now, multifamily, and even a bunch of the residential investors that I know are like saying, well, I can make more in multifamily, I'm gonna jump. But that sounds great, but what are the real risks? Like what are you really getting into, and what do you need to be aware of, before you go from, hey, I'm a residential fix and flip investor or a wholesaler, to all of a sudden now I want to buy, multifamily with a long-term hold or even, flipping it or whatever. What are they really getting into?
Well, it really just depends on what their exit strategy. You always want to start with the end in mind. What is it, your end goal, before you go into a property? If your end goal is wanting to buy and hold for a long time, so that could be a little bit less risky if you're overpaying for a property in this marketplace. If you're an investor, like, I would say 80% of our transactions that have happened from 19 to 21 that were coming from California. And remember, 90% of all our investors are actually out of state. They're not here. And they're betting on the market to, I'm going to buy this property, put a little lipstick, a paint on job on it, raise the rents a little bit, maybe rehab 30% of the units, and then I'm going to be able to exit for X amount of price. Well, that could be backfiring on them right now. And that's what I'm seeing typically actually happening right now. I do have a transaction that I will share with you guys. I actually have a podcast with Jamil about it. I think that's Pace's partner. We went in on a off-market deal last summer, and I think we went in contract around April, May, and it was a slam dunk. All the mortgage brokers were all excited. They were like basically like salivating over it. I was like, oh my gosh, this property's worth 15.5 million. And we're gonna, we got it for 12.5. It's an incredible deal. And larger deals you typically go non-refundable on. I felt like we couldn't lose based off the quotes we got from the lenders, CBRE, and other like private institutions that we're getting quotes from. And within 5 weeks, we had 5 rate hikes, and the deal became no longer financeable. And that has never happened to me out of 1,000 transactions. So going into that transaction, I tried everything I possibly could. Even going to Capital Fund was the only lender at that point that would still fund the deal. But I remember I kept the end in mind, and we're already in 450,000 plus another 30,000 in attorney fees, and then inspection fees and all those other things that were going into this property. And I said, let's look at permanent financing. I know initially we're looking at bridge financing. Let's go into permanent. Well, all the quotes out of 17 lenders, Marcus and Millichap, CBRE, Cushman, like all these different companies that were offering us rate quotes were only giving us 5,000. And I was like, guys, I went to Jamil and Pace at the time, and I said, we're going to lose this building within less than a year. I'm like, we need to cut this deal loose. And they were like, no, like it's a, like we'll close. It's okay. We'll use the write-off. I'm like, no, guys, we're going to lose this property. I'm like, we went back several times to the seller to negotiate a price of, $9 million, $7 million, $8 million. And the sellers were attorneys from Canada. They were cold as ice. And they basically told us to go pound sand. And the biggest heartbreak on that one was, like they got lenders, other brokers' opinions are like, oh yeah, the market's not going down. They went to larger institutional brokers. Sophia doesn't know what she's talking about. Like that was hard to tell my partners no. I said, guys, I care about you so much. I'm just going to give you your guys' down payment back. So I took the hit for $480,000, and it was a hard loss. But, it's kind of funny is, we ended up seeing that the market, after I said no, started going really down. And then another big reason why I said no was I saw last July, we had the highest eviction rate since 2008, 5,500 evictions. So I was paying attention to all the things that the other brokers and other people weren't paying attention to. And since I'm a native and I watched my dad ever since I was a little kid and watched the patterns for the last 30, 40 years, people don't see those things that I see. So telling them no was a hard lesson, but I know we saved a lot by not losing that asset, losing our down payment, not being able to refi in a year. Other syndication groups right now are not so lucky. They are losing their assets. Those things are actually happening. And obviously, like I said, the rents is the first time here in Phoenix that have inverted for the first time in 10 years. And we went from a 4.5% vacancy to more closer to a 10, 11% vacancy. So if I would have bought that asset, just, I don't want to lose that money, I would have lost so much more, not just because of the negative cash flow. It's because the building was actually ended up being worth so much less. Jamil just called me the other day. We're still really good friends, and he'll definitely wants to invest with me again, which is great, because I like to keep my relationships real. I've never lost a penny of anybody's money, and I never plan to. So with him, he's like, guess what the building just sold for? I'm like, how much? He's like 8.4 million. So right where I said I would trade it. And those sellers, they could have worked with us. But you know what? It's okay. I'm happy they didn't, because it was just to prove a point. Like, I'm like, even though everybody was telling me I was wrong, I knew deep down I was right, because I had the ability to recognize those patterns. So, and then the reason why I believe I lost money on this deal is because I broke my own golden rule. And this is what I always tell my investors. Do not buy master metered buildings and do not buy majority ones and studios. Now, I broke my own rule because it was in Arcadia Light. It was like a really good location. The building was in really good shape, and there was only a little bit of more upside that we needed to do to the property. But breaking my own rule made me lose in this one.
Interesting. So, sorry, Andy.
No, go
I'm
for
talking
it.
over
Go
you.
for it.
So to follow up on that, I mean, obviously, you're seeing some key indicators in this market of, maybe causing some issues in the multifamily space. Obviously, there's still opportunity and
Oh,
still
yes.
investment opportunities. So let's just talk about today's market. What should an investor be looking at and trying to identify to determine whether or not a multifamily, property is a good investment?
So you want to look at the current marketplace. You want to go where like new jobs are going right now. Obviously, Phoenix is still growing, but we still have a long way from where our prices were at a year ago. So the market's still continuing to go down here. So the only way I think it actually makes sense to get into a larger deal right now is if there's assumable debt, if there's already like an existing Fannie or Freddie note currently in place and they didn't pay too much for the property and you're looking at more of like a 10 plus year hold, then it makes sense. But if you're wanting to like get in something quickly, turn it, burn it, it's just not happening right now here in Phoenix. This is more of a buy and hold market. You're looking at least anywhere from a 2 to 5 year hold, maybe even longer, because like the market's still going down, the vacancy's still going up, and the rents are actually decreasing still.
So you mentioned that two of your rules, which is no master metered properties, and no, I think you said studios.
Yes.
So talk to us about those. Why are those your rules? What are the issues with both of those items?
Well, let's give an example of COVID. So a lot of people ended up, not being able to necessarily pay the rent. There's a more people like roommating together now to be able to offset like people's actual income that has came in. So you're going to have more of a transient tenant when you're looking at a studio. A one bedroom might be a little bit more obtainable, but you don't want all your units being ones. Now, it might be okay if you're in Tempe, you're right next to ASU, but still there's so much competition out there for more units. And then like if you're a student, you can actually share your rent with another roommate. So it makes it a little bit more affordable and obtainable. It's like our prices went up so high, but our income has not. So that's why we're in this situation that we're in here in Phoenix right now.
Well, what about the master metered? What's the issue there?
So master metered means that like you can place what we call a RUB system where you can do the utility reimbursement back. But if that tenant ends up not paying their utility balance, you're left with that existing electric bill. So lenders don't like to lend as much on those master meter buildings. Again, like you have to lock in like the actual utility costs included in the rent. And if that person bails on the rent, they're also bailing on that utility cost. So you're going to take more of a loss if you have a vacancy versus someone that's actually, being able to pay and make that cost difference for that utility right there. So, instead of just losing $1,000, you're also losing another $200 to utilities cost as well. So you add that up and you keep on adding that up. That makes the building less likely to be able to cash flow.
So yeah, so some of the older properties, just so that, like Andy said, some of our listeners may not be fully aware of this space and they're just kind of learning. But some of the older properties, basically every unit is on 1 meter, as opposed to some of the newer properties where the actual tenant calls up the utility provider and says, turn on my electricity to unit 5, and they pay their electric bill, and if they don't, then it's the utility company's problem, right?
Yes.
Versus on a master meter, basically the landlord is providing electricity via 1 meter to the entire unit. So
Yes,
that,
and then you have also the boiler system. So if that system goes down here in Arizona, you're paying for a lot of people to go into a hotel. So it adds up very quickly, and that's a very expensive capital expenditure that goes with like those master meter buildings. It's not just one AC, it's like the whole building.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you get a few tenants or even, multiple tenants that aren't paying their fair share. And that's a big hit on a landlord.
Yes. Yes.
What about rehabs? Properties that need significant repair.
Oh, I love those.
You love those. Okay, so tell the aspiring investor what they should be looking at, how to identify those, and what they need to be prepared for.
So I actually created a course called Learning Apartments, and I spent the last 16 months actually filming my flips and also in studio going over every single detail on actually how to flip a multifamily investment. Because when I go buy a multifamily investment, a lot of times people can't see the value into that particular deal. Like, I'll give you an example. I bought a building. It was 4030 North Parkway. It was just a little 4 unit. It was $905,000, and the sales price was 205. It was negative cash flow, but that property needed everything. And I was like, you know what? I know I can raise the rents. I know I can make this look a lot better. So what I did was I spent about $300,000 on the rehab. We redid the exterior, we made the landscaping beautiful, and, gutted the inside, and it was about 75,000 per door. When I say 75,000 per door, I'm talking about exterior, interior, and, like, any other additional costs that came to that unit. But so I went in, like, with that property in mind, and it took me about 6 months. So, like, if you're, like, looking to flip and you're looking at the cash flow model, it doesn't make sense. But you have to see past that. What is your exit? What's your end goal, like, in mind? So, like, with this particular one, we sold it in 4 days, all cash, and I sold it for 2.3 million. So it was 575,000 a unit in Old Town Scottsdale for 1970s construction, which is absolutely insane. But this is what I did. My strategy is I found a lease arbitrage where it was a tenant that ran an Airbnb business out of it. So I was able to have the tenant pay $2,800 per unit for 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath units. And they also paid all utilities, insurance, everything. So it's like I'm like basically like a retail office tenant. So somebody was like, coming from an out-of-state investor, that's like easy investment for them because they don't have to worry about, hey, like, did your dog die? Like, they don't have the sad story of a tenant. I personally don't like dealing with tenants. I like dealing with professionals, and most of my remodels and my flips, I have put in a professional tenant that runs a business out of them. So that one we made about 1.2 million on in 6 months, just a little 4 unit. So that's why I like these little properties. They sell quickly.
Is there a lot of competition for those right now?
Yes. So the reason why I'm able to get these properties is, one, I'm licensed. Also, two, I do mass marketing. So I do 7,000 mailers a month asking investors to sell their buildings to me. And I only focus on the 2 to 100 unit range. I don't go after the larger institutional deals because they're never going to get my mail. Most of the time it's like have board members. They're not going to be like opening the mail. Should I accept an offer on my property? They're not going to, that's not the type of, they're not going to respond to me. So, but the reason why I go after my niche is because they trade every 18 months or less, or I'll see them trade sometimes every 2 to 3 times a year. So that's why I'm in my niche. It's the highest turning piece of real estate actually in our marketplace.
Well, it goes to show you how important knowing your niche is, right?
Yes.
So this is kind of we're kind of meandering away here from the topic, but I think it's one to consider, having gone through the process and trying to understand what your niche is in real estate, because real estate is such a broad term. I mean, it means so many different things.
Yes.
How important is it to learn that? And how would you, if you could talk to your 20-year-old self again, you obviously learned from your father and some others. How can they kind of develop their niche?
Well, it really just depends on what you're passionate about. I was raised differently, like we didn't have AC growing up in our house. If I didn't have my breakfast eaten in the morning, had it waiting for dinner, I had a different upbringing than most. I wasn't privileged. I had to work for everything that I've had, and I've had over 35 jobs, and I found out the best job working is for myself. And so finding out like what I identify with, and I like to make money quickly. Time is money. I don't want to like go out there and try to, sell something that I'm not really interested in, because like I rather sell something that like I know that makes money quickly and trades very often. So if you look at it like a bigger, like just here in Arizona, there's like 43,000 licensed agents here, and there's maybe half that are actually active. And there's only like 65 of us that actually chase apartments. So our niche is like a niche of a niche, very, very exclusive. And so, like, you want to have that reputation that you know what you're doing. Otherwise, they'll never work with you again. You don't want to get the bad name in this business. So, I work with a lot of different other brokers as well that I respect in the community. And so, we're all like out there trying to hustle, but you don't want to burn anybody because they'll never work with you again.
What about financing strategies? So this all sounds great in theory, but you got to have the money to do it. Let's talk about the different financing strategies and which ones you prefer. And maybe the answer to that changes depending on the given market that we're in.
Yes, absolutely. So, for me, like if it's a residential deal, if there is an existing note that we can wrap, I love those. Like I love doing seller carryback financing. If I like doing wraps if there's an opportunity. I'm seeing more seller carrybacks available now just because of the current marketplace that we're in. If I'm wanting to get into a deal quickly, I like to do the hard money because I can close, I can perform, and then I can typically get a better price on that asset. When it comes to like commercial bridge financing, I do like those if they're offering the rehab cost. So that's why it's less money out of pocket. I'll give you an example. I did one I sold it in February of 22. It was a 20 unit here in Tempe. I did about $400,000 in rehab, but I said I actually spent 700, but I really didn't. But that was able to help me offset other costs, and you're able to manipulate the numbers a little bit with the contractor to be able to pull more funds out of that lender. I was able to get that 20 unit deal with just 15% down. They gave me all the money for rehab, so I was able to make about 1.3 million on that one for my exit. And that one I think I held for about 10 months, but that one I got off market, of course. And it was going to go to permanent debt after a certain point. So I was in a good place with that particular note. I think the rate on that one was, I think, like in the sixes or sevens, but I was fine with that because they were giving me all the money up front to be able to do the rehab. And I was still cash flowing because I got it for a good enough price. I actually got that one, I think, for 195, 205 a door in 21, and I got it with Chris Roach at Colliers.
So if an investor wants to go the loan route or raise capital, where do they even begin to start? And do they start before they find the property? How does that process best begin?
The best source I can say is find the deal first. The hardest thing is to actually find a deal. The money will come as long as you find the deal. And this is why I created my course, is because most brokers won't share the best deals. They'll either buy it themselves or they'll give it to their best buyer. But if you find the deal, the money will come just based off of people's networks and net worth. You can use other people's resources or money to be able to take a deal down. If you actually find that deal and you're able to at least tie it up, that's all that really matters. And, like for me, it's taken me obviously some time to learn how to master my niche, find off market opportunities. And this is why now I want to give back to the community. I want to teach people how to fish and not be dependent on another broker or another investor bringing them a deal. Now they'll be able to find these off market deals and opportunities themselves.
Tell us a little bit more about your course. Where could somebody find that?
You can go to learningapartments.com. We are officially launching September 1st, but they can actually purchase it now.
Okay.
And so we have different tiers and different programs depending on where people want to start. I even have a software called Pro Underwriter. So you can underwrite a deal in 30 seconds or less. So that way you never miss out on an opportunity again. Now, what happens is typically you can underwrite a deal and underwrite a deal and underwrite a deal. And then like by that time I already bought the property. I've like taken out like investors and they were telling me about a deal and then I was actually already tying it up and I'm like, I'm sorry, I already bought the property. That has happened on a lunch hour before. Because like I can make a decision on a property typically less than a minute and I already know where it is. I know what the cash flow is going to be and what my exit strategy can be. But that has to do with me recognizing the patterns over the years. So I'm like, I want to be able to show people how to be able to recognize patterns too, because that ultimately will determine the legacy and the wealth that you want to create for yourself.
Talk to us about the due diligence period. I know that there's a number of differences between multifamily, commercial, and just straight up residential. But for maybe the real estate investor that's just started in the single family residential space and they want to move to this, how different is the due diligence period and what should they expect?
Okay, so typically, if you're doing a larger deal, you will have to have some skin in the game. Typically, it will be non-refundable. If you have an investor, if you're going in a larger deal and they're not making it refundable, making it refundable, it's going to be like an opportunity for you to being able to do all your due diligence. Typically, it's about 30 days minimum. If you can get a 45-day financing contingency, that's always great too. You want multiple ways out of your contract. Typically, like you're going to need an environmental, a survey, and then you're going to need like contractors to come through to check all the operating equipment, make sure everything's accounted for. And then you're also going to want to take an inventory of any operating equipment with that property. Seeing if you can actually get like a certified property manager, somebody that's actually going to want to take an asset that's smaller or larger, just depending on what space that you're checking in. So typically with a smaller apartment space, this is why they trade so often, is because they're mismanaged. But if you're looking at the larger institutional deals, you want to get a certified property manager, someone that actually wants to put their time and effort and energy into that property. That's going to make it more of a community and not people like coming in and out and running their own businesses out of your own units.
Well, I think you make a good point that much of the due diligence is controlled by the purchase contract itself.
Yes.
And timelines that are dictated by the purchase contract. And I guess that's the case in just about all real estate transactions, but in your residential transaction,
You
usually,
can pretty much get out of it.
well, that
Almost.
and the purchase contract's just given to you by your agent and you just go with it and
Yeah,
you
there's
just
no real teeth in it.
yeah, and there's really not any negotiations over time periods to object to.
Yeah, and the due diligence items, like them actually giving you the leases, like that 53 unit, they didn't even want to give us the leases. They're like, oh, that's not typically done. I'm like, screw yourself. Yes, it is. I'm like, I don't know what I'm getting into. Let me see every single lease. I actually had to have a property manager go to that property and scan every freaking lease. What a time waster that was.
Now, will you contractually on the purchase contract side of things, going into the deal, you know whether you're dealing with a 2-door unit or a 100-door unit or
Yes.
50, let's say. Will you, in those cases, I'm assuming that more doors means more due diligence.
Yes.
So just depending on what you're dealing with, you'll construct the timeframes and the
Yeah,
contract
and
to fit that.
and I feel like if they're not willing to provide the leases, that's a red flag for me because I want to know what business I'm inheriting. And the easiest way to eliminate that is doing an estoppel for every single tenant there and basically interviewing each tenant. What are you actually paying? Let me see proof of that. Let me see bank statements. Let me see your lease. Let me see this certified, like, hey, this is what I'm actually paying, and see if it actually matches up. Because, like, if you're talking like a couple $100 less per unit, that can drop the sales price of the building several $1 million very quickly.
Mhm.
So having a seller like say, oh, you don't need this and you don't need that, those are all red flags to me.
Yeah, that would seem to be the case because on the flip side, of course, if everything's leased up and you've got good leases, that's a selling point, right?
Yes.
This property now justifies you paying more for it because we've done such a good job. So the contrary you would think would
It's
be
like
true if
you're
you're not going to show
inheriting
it.
somebody else's business and you want to make sure it's a smooth running business. Now for my niche, the smaller unit range, I'm lucky if I get a lease. I have sellers that have owned the property for 30, 40 plus years and they have zero financials. So I'm very good at selling properties, making a pro forma, and then educating an out-of-state investor that calls me and says, hey, is this a property? And then, you make sure you get the right management in place and like, what is their exit strategy? I never put people in a situation that I don't feel like that would be the right fit for their end goal. So for me, like I do a lot more up front versus just slamming them into a deal and hoping that like they'll have success with it.
I'm curious, are there any particular provisions that you like to look out for in the tenant leases that
Yeah.
are just a nightmare and you're like, if we find these, because usually if it's a form contract that the landlord's been using, so it's going to be in all of them
I
if you find it
see
in
a
one.
lot of other families living in properties. So like you go and like it's just 2 people on the lease, but you notice that there's 8 people living there.
And they're not named on the lease kind of thing?
Correct. Yeah. So those are red flags. That's really important that you walk all the units. I know typically with like larger deals, they don't walk all the units, but I'm like, you don't know what you're inheriting and you don't know what your loan will end up being, not knowing these things up front, because how are you going to sustain that loan that you're getting into based off of their information and you didn't verify it? Because you could be setting yourself up to actually lose that property in less than a year or 2, depending on what you actually did your due diligence on. So I'll give you an example. I had a guy that did all his flips here in Arizona, and he's like, I want more doors, more better. Like you can get cheaper doors in Chicago. Well, he took his, like I think he had 7 doors, he had 12, 7, and then he just kept on flipping them. And he took all his money to go to Chicago to get 36 doors. It was a better price. He was like around $90,000 to $100,000 per unit at the time, and Arizona at that time was selling for like $250,000 to $300,000 a unit. Well, COVID hit, and he couldn't get supplies to finish up his renovation. All the tenants that were living there didn't have to pay rent, and he only had a 1-year bridge, so he didn't protect himself, and his broker didn't protect him in that due diligence period because he was just going to flip it. But my point is like if half your building is vacant and then you didn't do your due diligence on the people that were existing there, they're paying your like note, you could lose your property. And he actually ended up losing his property within 1 year.
Wow. Interesting. Well, Sophia, we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. We've learned a ton, and we've only scratched the surface, right?
Yes.
Tell our listeners how they can find you and connect with you.
Yeah, they can go to gracecre.com, which is our brokerage, or they can go to learningapartments.com and connect with us there.
Awesome. Sophia Willets, thank you so much for being with us. Feel free to reach out to Sophia, and hopefully we can have you back on again. We'd love to learn more. With that, everybody, that is our show. Make sure to join us tomorrow for the Creative Finance Collective, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.
Sophia.
All right. Bye-bye.